The theatre plunges into darkness. There is no music, no applause, only the deep beating of a heart that seems to fill every seat, and the raw breathing into the microphone as if life itself were testing the sound. Before any melody begins, a question pierces the darkness. Who told me my story? It's not a dramatic effect, it's a reckoning. Silence here is not absence, it's argument. It opens space for the audience to acknowledge the weight of everything they've heard, and above all, what they've never been able to hear. An initial chord threatens to emerge and is cut off mid-sentence, dry, like a headline that decides where. A biography begins and ends. For years, the narrative has been reshaped by other people's hands, cameras that waited for stumbles, flashes that caught only chaos, voices that exaggerated falls and whispered new beginnings. The audience knows this, even if they won't admit it. They know it because they've learned to confuse spectacle with truth. Tonight, the abrupt cut of that first sound is the first rewrite. No one will have the power to decide when the song begins. The light finally reveals a microphone on its own. It's not a neutral object. It's become a courtroom, a confessional, a trench. Approaching it, the narrator doesn't seek absolution, but rather restores context. There's no apology, no romanticizing of pain. There's a commitment to dismantling myths with bodily facts. The body that breathes, the voice that warms, the presence that doesn't fit into tabloid paragraphs. The show doesn't promise magical redemption, it promises something rarer: perspective. In this space, traces that almost never had a canvas reappear. Notebooks with lyrics scratched out in the early hours, rehearsals in which the band laughs at a mistake and tries again, technical exercises, breathing, phrasing, internal timing, treated as part of the craft and not as a backstage curiosity. The idea of natural talent loses its luster when confronted with hours of study, with the demands of an artist who knew how to say no when yes would have sold more. This is the first shock for those who came only for the myth. There is method. Behind the hurricane, the audience is also invited. Those who bought tickets unwittingly bring pre-packaged opinions, memes, and memories, distorted by 15-second clips. The prologue becomes a mirror. What did you do with the story you received? Where did you look when context was missing? When the artist asks who spoke for her, the question also pierces the seats. Who speaks for you when you're not there? And what do you do with the truth when it doesn't fit in a headline? Suddenly, a breath of music brushes the air again. Not to advance, but to mark the boundary between what the audience thinks they know and what they still need to discover. The promise is clear. This will be her version. Not a sanitized cleansing, but an honest rearrangement, where pain and humor, failure and discipline, love and boundaries occupy the same stage. It's a warning and an invitation. If you came to confirm what you already believe, you might leave uncomfortable. If you came to listen, you might leave transformed. And that's precisely why, before any complete song, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to the first contract, not to the first review, but to a room stacked with records, to an ordinary neighborhood where a girl discovered old voices and shaped her own timbre. To understand why the world wanted her in so many pieces, we need to know who she was as a whole. Ready to open the door to Southgate and see where this story truly begins? Southgate isn't a myth. It's a street, a creaking gate, neighbors who know each other's names, and a bus that's always late. It's the kind of place where music first arrives through the window, the radio in the kitchen next door, the record player in someone's living room, the whistle of someone returning from the grocery store. There, a girl grew up like so many, but with a record collection that felt like a treasure trove. Old school jazz, soul that doesn't ask for permission, Motown that sets the heart's tempo. While the world didn't yet know her name, she already knew how to listen, and listening there was already half the battle. The family had its own cadence. Quick laughs, scoldings that ended in hugs, stories repeated on Sundays as if they were songs. There was pride in their roots and a sense of humor that served as a life preserver when the tide was high. In this house, music wasn't just a decoration, it was the lingua franca. A chorus served to apologize, a scat to overcome shyness, an improvised chorus to celebrate whatever was possible. The talent that the world would one day call a miracle begins here, in the homely repetition, in the small scenes where sensitivity learns to defend itself without losing its sweetness. It was also there that the girl discovered that reference is a map, not a prison. Dinah Washington taught the proper weight of words. Sarah Vaughan, the art of contour. Aretha, the courage to tear without losing elegance. Each vinyl was a classroom without a desk, each voice a teacher pointing different directions to the same. Question: what, after all, does it mean to own your own sound? At Southgate, between schoolwork and notebook scribbles, this question took shape, and an urgency that not even routine could stifle. Art school came like a window suddenly opening. In a stuffy room. There, technique was given a name. Breathing, support, placement, phrasing. But what really ignited was the feeling of belonging to a place where strangeness didn't need to apologize. While some saw only attitude, those nearby saw an embryonic method. Hours experimenting with musical accents, attacks and sustains, testing internal timing. The charisma that would one day fill stages began in cramped rehearsal rooms, where the voice learned to warm up before taking risks. In the neighborhood, life remained simple, and perhaps for that very reason, so fertile. Small bar stages, nights, where the audience was half distracted, half curious, and a persistence that already announced that music would not be a hobby. There were stumbles, notes that wouldn't land, verses written too much then too little, and there was the joy of making mistakes in public without collapsing. Each timid applause was a silent contract. "I'll be back tomorrow, better," and she returned. With more lyrics, more precision, more courage. The Southgate girl also collected silences, those minutes before singing when her entire body decides whether to sing or not. Many people mistake this for insecurity. In reality, it's listening. The moment when the artist measures the room, the mood, the state of her own soul, and chooses how to deliver her message. This ritual, learned early, would be the key to breaking through hostile audiences and transforming noise into attention. Before any note, there was an internal question: how do I deliver this today? And herein lies the turning point you might not have seen in the clippings. There wasn't a bolt of lightning, a Hollywood suddenly. What happened was an accumulation of small gestures, trials, falls, domestic discoveries. Southgate didn't fabricate a myth. He provided the foundation for an identity to emerge. The rest, the awards, the headlines, the wonder, would come later. But without this foundation, everything would have crumbled early. Now that you've entered this house, listened to these radio stations, and leafed through these notebooks, a question begins to nudge you. How, from this raw material, does a timbre emerge that no one else has? If you listened closely and realized, there are more layers than the legend allows. Get ready. The next door opens to the moment when curiosity becomes voice, because a childhood of listening and laughter must one day decide how it wants to sound. And when that decision is made, the story changes its tone, and you will hear it. At first, her voice wasn't whole. It came in fragments, an over-tested vibrato, a note that insisted on falling, an S that slipped prematurely. It was in the rehearsal lab, vintage microphone, imperfect feedback, empty auditorium, that she learned to listen to her own instrument as if tuning a compass. 4-beat, breathing, low support, phrasing that didn't deliver everything at once. More than power, she pursued intention. Each syllable needed to carry motive, not just volume. Between takes, she discovered that the voice finds itself when it decides what it isn't. She wouldn't imitate, no matter how much she could. She borrowed. The acidic grain of jazz divas, the clean cut of soul, the stubborn swing of R&B, and began to reject what sounded merely pretty. Affinity became a filter. If the melody didn't call for truth, she trimmed it. If the words didn't fit in her mouth, she changed the words. If the beat didn't breathe with it, she delayed it a millimeter. The timbre was born less from gift and more from a fierce curation of her own taste. The technique, far from immobilizing her, opened up space for risk. By mastering the silence between notes, she gained license to play with tempo, anticipate an attack, bite the punchline, stretch an ah on a nearly invisible thread, and still keep the entire band on the same page. The audience, when present, didn't understand where the thrill came from, but they felt it. It was the rare marriage of control and abandon. On the outside, accuracy. On the inside, a heart willing to make mistakes to discover a new path. In her notebooks, the lyrics stopped asking for permission. She wrote like someone in conversation, direct, ironic, sometimes affectionate, sometimes cutting, and tested the weight of each verb on the microphone. A single sentence went through 5 or 6 intonations before landing. The song was only hers when the pronunciation already carried a story. And that's when timbre stopped being just a voice color and became a narrative signature. You recognized not only who was singing, but also where that person was speaking from. In the improvised studio, she learned to negotiate with technology without betraying the raw material. She knew that certain microphones fatten frequencies, that certain compressors tame breaths, that too much reverb washes away the truth. She asked for less effect and more skin, less trickery and more presence. When the recording sounded too perfect, she went back a step. She wanted to hear the magnet of the human, the roughness that makes the story stick. With the band, the encounter was one of language. Bass and drums understood that the voice needed space to dance above without losing its footing. Wind instruments learned to respond as if they were characters in the dialogue. The piano discovered the exact place for a chord that nudges without disturbing. Rehearsals became conversations, conversations became arrangements, and the arrangements began to protect the timbre as if it were a flame on a windy night. On stage, this translated into courage. She could whisper and no one would get lost. She could explode and no one would run. The plot twist the public rarely sees is that this voice, raw, recognizable, impossible to mistake, was built with an athlete's discipline. A warm-up routine, vocal hygiene, days of silence, technique. Notebooks alongside her lyric notebooks. A firm no to anything that sounded flashy or empty. The impression of spontaneity was the culmination of almost obsessive work. And precisely because of this, when she opened her mouth, the room understood they were in the presence of someone who knew what she wanted to say and how she wanted it to sound. And then comes the inevitable moment, when this timbre, now in control of itself, leaves the lab and touches the city for the first time. What happens when the voice that learned to choose every note finds a club microphone, a real audience, and the possibility of becoming history beyond the neighborhood? If you want to see the spark turn into a fire, it's time to light the lights. For the next act, the spark doesn't feel like a spark when you're in it. It's a Thursday night show in a club that smells of old wood and spilled beer, a squeaky microphone, a stubborn feedback loop. The band makes room, and the voice, now in control, hits the first attack like someone finding the right door latch. Half the audience came to chat, the other half to drink, but without warning, the buzz dies down. 2 songs later, someone puts their glass down and forgets to pick it up again. That's where true word of mouth is born. A thrill spreads faster. than any press release. Frank, it doesn't fall from the sky. It arrives as a conversation that refuses the veneer of discourse. Lyrics that sound like testimonials, arrangements that prefer the resilience of jazz to the rush of fashion, humor that cuts off before the final sentence. The album doesn't ask for permission. It offers a point of view. Attentive critics hear the intention, the public finds a mirror, and the first nighttime radio stations dare to play tracks that don't sound easy. The name, still small on the posters, begins to draw lines at the door. The time-lapse of this rise is cruel and fascinating. Bar basements become afternoon festivals. Mediocre festivals become TV stages. Timid interviews become headlines. With each step, a new label tries to stick. Revelation, phenomenon, controversial, promising. The schedule stiffens. Suitcases move to the hallway. Airports replace addresses. The face becomes a shortcut to clicks. The body suddenly has too many owners, and the initial question, who told my story for me, returns with new gravity. With light comes the demand for templates. Talk less between the lines, smile more on take two, deliver a chorus that fits in the car between two lights. The frank conversation that gave the album its name meets the demand for short sentences. The artist who loves silence between notes receives spreadsheets of timed seconds. Acidic humor becomes an image risk, the unthought of as a lack of gratitude. Visibility opens doors, but it also installs hinges that creak every time she tries to close them from the inside. On stage, however, autonomy still finds refuge. The band understands the pact to protect the space where the voice breathes. Set lists become secret strategies to cater to radio without betraying the soul, to open with the blues that organize the house, to insert a raw version that calls for pyrotechnics. There are nights when the music trumps the script. The audience forgets the hit and follows the story. There are others when the hit demands tribute and the story must give way half a step. Neither victory nor defeat. Negotiation. The backstage climate also changes. Where there used to be little equipment and a lot of chatter, there are now technicians, stylists, advisors, and contracts that speak volumes. Every yes comes with a footnote. Every no comes with a fee. The artist discovers that autonomy has its own accounting. The price of maintaining a free tone is sometimes losing a cover, a festival, a sponsorship. And yet, she tests the limits. She adjusts arrangements, rejects overly polished effects, chooses the least convenient and most truthful word. The press, part of it, wants the character to be complete in a question and a half. In the back and forth between curiosity and invasion, fatigue isn't dramaturgy, it's consequence. The same cameras that help reach those who would never hear the music also capture stumbles as if they were the plot. None of this extinguishes the spark, but it changes the oxygen of the fire. It grows faster, heats up more, and requires more care to avoid turning to soot. And then there's the audience, which isn't a monolith. Between hasty judgments and devoted loves, gestures emerge that hold the artist by the invisible arm. A fan asking for silence during the solo, a letter thanking her for a lyric that saved a bad day, a band that closes around her when the noise from outside threatens to overflow. These scenes don't make headlines, but they support the edifice. They're the memories she pulls when she needs to remember why she started. The rise, finally, reveals the paradox. The more people listen, the more voices want to dictate what will be said. Visibility expands reach. Autonomy struggles not to shrink. Between the underground that provided shelter and the world that demands performance, the artist learns to walk on the edge. One foot in the light, the other on its own axis. But every edge, sooner or later, encounters the machine that turns on its own. And when the industry's gears decide to speed up, the stage ceases to be the only place where music happens and becomes the only place where it can still rule. How? Much does it cost to keep this island of control lit when everything around demands standardization, haste, and predictability? The answer comes in the next act, when the glitter turns into a demand, and the contract tries to govern even the silence. Want to hear how much a no said into the right microphone costs? The machine turns on with a click you can't hear, but feel. The day begins to have invisible markers. Hotel call at 6 a.m., interview at 8 a.m., photo shoot at 9:30 a.m., rehearsal at 11 a.m., lunch in 20 minutes, sound check at 3 p.m., meet and greet at 5 p.m., show at 9 p.m., quick after, flight at 4 a.m. Between one appointment and the next, life has to fit into corridors. The schedule becomes a track, and if you stumble, the train doesn't stop. It runs over you. On the stage of this act, the sound slows down, and a chorus of voices reads, demands like psalms. Talk about the single at minute 2. Don't change your costume mid-set. Avoid long pauses between songs. Smile on take B. No off-key answers. 3 stories before the encore. The audience listens and laughs nervously. The band, silent, follows the metronome of the orders. It's a choreography of power. Each rule attempts to transform an artist into a product with a manual. The image, which should protect what the music says, starts trying to say it for itself. The eyeliner becomes a logo, the dress becomes packaging, the hair becomes a meeting agenda. There are kind professionals, there are people passionate about what they do, but the sum of all these intentions creates a character that demands rent inside the body. And when the person gasps for air, the persona screams, "You still owe me a post." Outside, no one respects behind-the-scenes details. Cars emerge from alleys, flashbulbs explode 2 feet away, questions are spat out like coins at a toll booth. A misstep becomes a gif. A weary look becomes a theory. A negative response becomes a headline. Difficult diva, ungovernable star. The world demands transparency and at the same time films through the cracks. The price of light is not being able to turn it off. In the offices, spreadsheets compete with sheet music for the agenda. 3 minutes and 5 minutes is the time. For the hit, cut the solo, we need the chorus sooner. This dramatic pause breaks down retention. Silence, once a tool, becomes suspect. And when the artist says no, the budget responds, fewer festivals, fewer covers, fewer invitations. The machine's favorite word is optimize. The artist's favorite is truth. They rarely rhyme. In the studio, negotiations become minute and exhausting. Raise the pitch a half step, it'll sound more radio-friendly. Double the vocals, take away the breathiness. Add an extra effect, hide the harshness. She listens. Tests, sometimes gives in, often not. Each no has a cost. It delays the schedule, changes campaigns, angers those counting on the quarterly bonus, and guilt sets in because there are technicians, musicians, and a team around her that she respects and doesn't want to hurt. But betraying her own truth costs more and lasts longer. Even the show, once sacred territory, is now subject to clauses that attempt to govern the unexpected. No improvisation on the 3rd track. No speeches. Avoid changing the tempo. She smiles briefly, agreeing with the band on signs of resistance, a look that unleashes a scat, a gesture that opens space for a slower tempo, a 2-second breath that's worth a manifesto. Autonomy becomes artistic contraband. The body takes its toll. Insomnia, anxiety, the feeling of always being on stage, even in pajamas. Someone offers shortcuts, something to speed up, something to slow down, something to numb. There's no glamour. Possible at this point, only risk. The artist knows her limits, tries to protect them, but the machine doesn't recognize Sunday. It whistles goals. It's a perfect environment to confuse care with control and medication with escape. Still, there are quiet victories. A new clause guaranteeing days of silence, a contract recognizing the right to change the arrangement live, a photographer who understands the "not today" message, a producer who backs the less obvious track. As a single, small cracks where air can see through. These are achievements the public rarely sees, but they keep the flame burning when the wind picks up. The uncomfortable revelation is simple. Saying no preserves integrity, but steals some. The peace. You sleep more faithfully and wake up to 3 missed calls from legal. Between the gears and the pulse, she chooses the pulse whenever she can, and pays for it whenever she needs to. Brilliance isn't a lie. Its price is usually in the fine, a print. And when the professional spotlight dims, life becomes unscripted. The affections, the absences, the bonds that heal and wound in the same gesture. That's when the cracks open, not on stage, but in the living room, on the phone, in the right hug at the wrong time. Want to understand how love can be both a harbor and a storm, and how dependence insinuates itself as a solution before revealing itself to be a prison? Then come to the next act, where romances write beautiful verses and invisible clauses. Love arrives like a port, and in a breath becomes open sea. Off stage, it offers a hug, a cup of tea at 3 in the morning, promises that this time it will be different, and it can be. For a few days, the world slows down. Laughter returns to faces, notes appear stuck to the fridge, the house smells like a beginning. But beginning isn't synonymous with healing. It's just the moment when 2 solitudes try to learn to walk side by side without tripping over the past. Romance, when it happens under invisible spotlights, tends to distort forms. What should be shelter becomes a mirror that magnifies brilliance and error. Small arguments gain an imaginary audience. Small gestures become proof of love or abandonment, and it is through this lens that dependencies begin to confuse care with control. A drink to relax before rehearsal, another to celebrate after the show, a third to silence the anxiety between one thing and another, until the count loses count. There's no glamour here, just the cold mathematics of habits. What relieves today exacts tomorrow with interest. Inside, the conversation doesn't stop. The artist says, "I need routine, water, sleep to say no." A wounded responds, "I need anesthesia, a break from the noise, someone to hold me when I collapse." They're both right, and that's why conflict is tiring. Between the external voices prescribing ready-made solutions and the internal voices urging survival, the ethical decision is slow. Admitting limits, seeking help, resuming practices that worked, accepting that relapses don't erase the miles already traveled. The song the world sings in the choir, the one many people reduce to a catchphrase, isn't a meme for its author. It's a frontier. She used it as a message and a mirror, not an inside joke. Serious people were nearby, professionals who care without turning pain into an issue, friends who know when to keep quiet, family trying to align affection and firmness. And there were real attempts, periods of sobriety, studio routines that replaced bars, stretching and warm-ups that served as protective rituals. Each entire day was a star glued to a private calendar. But romantic love, when it encounters old fissures, can become both glue and blade. It promises rescue and triggers, embraces and squeezes, saves and suffocates. This is called codependency, and in it the roles alternate. Savior, accomplice, victim, tormentor, masks exchange silently between kisses, apologies and promises. In some relationships, intensity becomes currency. In others, silence becomes toxic. Between one tour and the next, pacts are made. Now it's going to happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. In the studio, however, the compass reappears. Composition becomes a way to metabolize what doesn't fit into conversation. Instead of shouting, it purifies. Instead of accusing, it describes. Love is a losing game. It doesn't romanticize defeat. It crystallizes the ambiguity of someone. who gambled everything they had and, even so, understands that the bet said something true about themselves. Singing this isn't reopening a wound for show, it's stitching it together with melodic thread. But every surgery carries risk. Reliving. The scene to extract meaning can, on bad days, reactivate the wound. The band becomes a safety net. There are prearranged signals. If the breath shortens, the bass lengthens the bridge. If the voice calls for water, the piano makes room. If the mind loses its way, the drums trace the path again. Off stage, there are homemade protocols. Calling. Someone you trust. Leaving before the peak. Swapping the bar for the studio. Saying, "Not today," to invitations that taste like a trap. It's not heroism, it's maintenance. On good days, that's enough. On bad days, that's all it takes to keep everything from falling apart. The tabloids on the outside prefer the cruel summary, either self-destructive muse or dramatic villain. There's no curiosity about the middle ground where real people live, the realm of small victories and discreet setbacks. And it's in this back and forth that loves continue to exist. Some beautiful and peaceful, others intense and exhausting. Almost all of them crossed by the same question: how can I love you without losing myself? How can I love myself without dragging you down? There's not always an answer in time to prevent the damage, sometimes only by learning from it. She, in turn, wasn't just what hurt. There was humor, there was tenderness, there was the simple pleasure of cooking for friends, of marathoning bad movies, of decorating a rented room with objects that tell stories. These fragments don't usually get clicks, but they explain why so many people stayed and persisted. It's easier to support someone who only suffers. It's more challenging to support someone who oscillates between brightness and shadow, courage and escape. Still, there were those who stayed, and those who reached out when pride wouldn't let them ask. It's important to say without hesitation, vulnerability isn't a stage aesthetic. It's a human fact. Addiction isn't a romantic plot. It's a disease that requires ongoing care, not audience opinions. And loving someone undergoing treatment means learning to separate a crisis from a character, a relapse from a failure, a request for help from blackmail. It didn't always work, but when it did, these small adjustments kept the artist breathing where the character was suffocating. At the end of this act, there is an image of two versions of the same woman walking side by side. Artist, who knows how to transform chaos into song without denying himself. Wounded, who needs time, therapy, clear boundaries, and people who listen. When they can talk, life moves on. When they can't, the outside world steps in with a megaphone and transforms what was once an intimate process into a judgmental spectacle. And it's to this megaphone that we turn now, because no love story, beautiful, difficult, real, survives intact when it becomes a public square. What happens when the entire city feels entitled to point fingers or open its arms? In the next act, you'll see how headlines, cameras, and real people influenced every yes, every no, and every breath taken into the microphone. The public square has no center, but it does have an echo. It's the place where everything becomes a chorus and nothing remains secret. The blurred photo of a stumble, the sentence ripped out of context, the video that ignores the minute before and the minute after. On the invisible stage of public opinion, the plot is decided by whoever shouts the loudest. And when someone's story becomes a public square, every mistake becomes a spectacle, every success becomes silence. Flashes build characters. A tired look is captioned unmanageable. A request for space becomes contempt for fans. A necessary pause is labeled whim. Tabloids know that scandal has more return than the process, and so they sell shortcuts. Guilty or sanctified, anything but human. The square doesn't demand context, it demands clicks. But the square isn't just about pointing fingers. Among the judges, there are people who hug without an audience. the fan who raises her hand to ask for silence when the solo begins, the security guard who blocks the hallway to prevent a camera from invading the dressing room, the taxi driver who turns off the gossip radio and asks simply, "Water or tea?" The opening musician who touches her shoulder and says, "If you want, we'll delay 5 minutes." These gestures don't make headlines, but they save nights. A long email thanking, a letter that prevented a rash decision, a drawing left on the concert railing with a scrawled, "Take care of yourself." The band that squeezes onto the stage to become a mural when eyes stray from the microphone and search for the ground. There's no glamour in this. There's humanity, which ironically, the public often forgets. Within the show, this act becomes a mirror. Headlines and commentary are projected onto the back of the stage like a jury. The audience lights come on, and the question returns directly. Do you want to judge or listen? The audience realizes that unintentionally they have always chosen, even when they remained silent. The music then responds with a minimalist, almost whispered version, forcing the ears to lean in closer. The volume doesn't increase, attention does. The reaction is mixed, as it always is in real life. People cry, people laugh nervously, people cross their arms trying to maintain the verdict they brought from home. The people try to decide in seconds who deserves empathy. But the song, when it's true, has an irritating property. It prolongs time. And in prolonged time, the tight certainties begin to loosen. There's also the court of morality, always ready to confuse illness with character. If I wanted to, I'd stop. If I loved my fans, I'd take care of myself. The public is an expert in magical solutions for pains they don't understand. But the show neither defends nor absolves. It contextualizes. It shows attempts, relapses, new beginnings, and asks if for a minute it's possible to exchange a sentence for listening. Inside, the exhibition takes its toll. The fear of going outside, the panic in front of a camera, the doubt whether that fan smile is a shelter or a trap. Living in a public square alters the chemistry of everyday life. You start making emotional calculations to cross the street. Still, the artist insists on appearing, not out of obligation, but because the music demands an encounter, and because, amidst the hustle and bustle, there's always a hug worth the journey. There are nights when the embrace wins. The audience sings softly so as not to drown out their voices. The bar reduces the clinking of glasses. The staff adjusts, the lighting as if making a bed. The square for a few minutes becomes a living room. That's when the myth falls away, and all that remains is what should have mattered from the beginning, a person saying something true to other people. And there are nights when the finger wins, the camera invades, the commotion dominates, a stumble turns into a procession. The band closes early, the lights go out before the encore, the corridor to the car feels like a maze. On these days, the artist picks up the pieces and promises herself two things: that she will protect herself better and that she will not let the square write the next chapter alone. The act ends with a simple gesture. She returns the microphone to its stand and, instead of leaving the stage, walks to the darkest part. From there, she silently observes the audience, as if gauging whether there's enough room for what comes next. Because what comes next doesn't fit in a headline. It's the attempts, the discreet falls, the stubborn restarts, the craft that anchors. When everything shakes, want to see how a voice is rebuilt amidst the noise. Then take a deep breath. The next chapter opens the studio door. The attempts begin small, almost invisible to outsiders. A glass of water where there used to be something else. 30 minutes of warming up before rehearsal, even when your body demands a shortcut. A "not today" said at the right time, without a long excuse. Stars drawn on a private calendar for each full day. A fresh start has no fireworks. It has routine. In the studio, music becomes a method of returning home. Take 1 to shake off the rust, take 2 to find air, take 3 to feel the story, and laughter in between, because laughter is also a survival technique. The microphone captures the breath before the note, not to expose weakness, but to remind us that life is there. A producer with good hearing asks for less effect, more skin. The band nods in agreement. The craft, when well practiced, makes the outside noise diminish. A relapse doesn't erase the mileage. That's the lesson hard to accept. Some days the plan works, and others the old solution knocks on the door, promising immediate relief. When you slip up, the accounting is honest. You talk to those in need, you reorganize the next day, you re-establish your rituals. Guilt wants to transform a stumble into identity. Practice insists on treating a stumble as an event. Getting back up becomes an everyday verb, not a grand finale. In rehearsals, careful signals are combined that don't disrupt the art. If the breath is short, the bass lengthens the bridge. If the mind wanders, the drums redraw the path. If the throat cries out for water, the piano opens a window of musical silence that feels like part of the arrangement. And when the night calls for a luminous respite, Valerie enters as a collective embrace, not to pretend everything is fine, but to remind the audience that the light is still on. The audience senses it without knowing how to explain it. Something is reorganized live. Arrangements are streamlined to restore focus to the voice. Fewer layers, more intention. More space is left between verses, distracting embellishments are trimmed, and a forced tone is changed. In some tracks, the tempo drops a foot to allow the entire story to fit. The result doesn't become an algorithmic hit, but it does become stage truth. And truth is the only fuel that doesn't charge exorbitant interest later. Outside the studio, care is almost domestic. Ginger tea in the late afternoon. A notebook within reach, a short walk before turning on the radio, quick messages to those who act as a safety net. Small routines that seem insignificant when recounted, but which add up to a silent wall against drifting. There are days when everything fails. On those, Plan B is simply not to fail tomorrow. Serious professionals step in discreetly, those who guide without ordering, those who listen without turning pain into an issue, those who propose schedules that protect the voice and the mind. Planned breaks between tours, rest periods that are worth more than an extra festival, commitments that are adjusted when health demands it. It's a policy of the possible, far from heroism and closer to maturity. The world doesn't always cooperate. Cancel a show when the crowd barks, lack of commitment. Hold the show on a bad day, and the crowd demands perfection. Between guilt and expectation, the choice becomes radical and simple. Life first. On difficult nights, honesty takes the microphone. Today I'm going slowly, but I'm going completely. It's surprising to see how the truth aligns a room. The band closes, the sound respects, the audience follows suit. New beginnings also happen in things that don't get clicks. Cooking for friends, watering a plant, organizing albums by mood, learning a new recipe, watching a silly movie on the couch. These gestures anchor us. They remind us that there's a person before the persona, and that the person deserves enough ordinary days for art to once again be a choice, not a crutch. Over time, the attempts stop feeling like a crisis and take on the appearance of practice. It's not a straight line. It's a mosaic. Some pieces seem to fit together until suddenly they become part of the picture. The important thing is to keep your hands working, because busy hands give your head room to breathe. Craft, after all, is the most faithful antidote to the narrative of inevitable disaster. And when the flame burns again to a healthy size, the question that always remains after storms arises: what remains of all this? What is learned? What is transmitted? What inspires those who come after? The next curtain opens on this answer, not in speeches but in echoes, because legacy is not a statue. It is a trail of light that others use to cross their own night. Do you want to see what remains and why it still matters? A legacy isn't a statue, it's a trail. After the storm, there's a path others can follow when the night itself closes in. In her case, what remains is not just a collection of songs, but a way of speaking, direct, ironic, tender, without embellishment where embellishment doesn't fit, and a pact with honesty that refuses an empty showcase. With each listen, the audience realizes it's not about memorizing choruses, it's about learning to listen to someone whole. Among artists, the trail is clear. Singers and composers from different generations cite that courage of not rounding out what's crooked just to fit on the radio. Legacy becomes authorization, to maintain one's own accent, to delay the attack a millimeter if the heart calls for it, to write verses that unapologetically exist. When a young voice decides to sustain the silence between two notes, there's much of that teaching there, not as copying, but as permission to be. In writing, the legacy is even deeper. She showed that vulnerability can be architecture, not window dressing. Lyrics that feel like kitchen chat, with humor that soothes, and cuts with the precision of someone who polishes words like a rare stone, opened the way for the confessional song to gain the muscle of a work. It wasn't about telling everything. It was about choosing what was necessary and supporting the weight of what was chosen. Today, many people compose with this invisible ruler in mind. Sincerity with discretion, emotion with form. Technically, it's a silent lesson on time and timbre, the use of space as part of the phrase, the game of pushing and pulling the beat without losing the band, the refusal to over-polish what needs roughness to remain true. Young musicians discover, in recordings and videos, that this spontaneity had method, warm-up, study, and that discipline doesn't kill the soul. It gives it shape, so it doesn't get lost. Today's rehearsals carry this lesson without needing to announce it. There's also a legacy of the industry's borders. Saying no at the right microphone cost covers, bookings and opportunities, and precisely because of that, paved the way for many people to better negotiate their own sound. Serious producers and teams have learned, and continue to learn, that artistic autonomy isn't a whim, it's a working condition. The market changes slowly, but it changes when someone pays the price first. In the cultural realm, the conversation about mental health and addiction is no longer taboo in dressing rooms and meeting rooms. The impact isn't in slogans, but in small policies that add up. Planned breaks, tours with respite, care protocols that don't treat a crisis as a spectacle. Fans have also reorganized. A significant portion have learned to prefer an honest cancellation to a risky performance. It's not a complete triumph, but it is progress, and it bears the mark of those who expose the wound without becoming one. The public inherited something else valuable, a repertoire that consoles not with sugar, but with truth. These songs serve to get us through good days, recalling the grace of detail, and bad days, providing language when words fail. That's why, years later, we still hear someone say they found themselves on a bridge, that they breathed easier because a verse held their hand. The legacy is measured in this intimate, domestic, almost invisible usefulness. Beyond the myth, what remains is the competent composer, the band leader who knew where each instrument shone without getting in the way, the professional who understood the studio and the stage. Separating persona, and work is not a cold exercise. It's the only way to honor what she truly left behind. When the story is told this way, the final gesture isn't repeated mourning, it's active gratitude, continuing to demand context in a world that loves easy cuts. In the show, this act takes shape through recorded testimonies from artists who listened to her as a beacon, and musicians who played alongside her, not to create a cult following, but to broaden the perspective. Between one speech and the next, concise versions remind us that what sustained everything was always the music, not the headlines. Upon leaving this passage, the audience carries a map. How a work can survive the character the world has constructed. And now that the trail is lit and the map in hand, the question remains that can only be answered live. What would she say if she could wrap up her own narrative in one final speech, without noise, without outside microphones? No epilogue, the light closes the circle and the truth sits at the microphone. Want to get close enough to hear what they never let her finish? The light warms the stage like a shy morning. The microphone alone seems less of an object and more of an invitation. She enters unhurriedly, breathes audibly, humanly, and the entire theatre follows this simple gesture as if setting its own pace. There are no effects, no frames. There is presence. The prologue asked, "Who told my story for me?" The epilogue begins by answering with the body, "From here on, it's me." She doesn't promise a course correction in a perfect speech, nor a tidy ending to ease consciences. She says that true stories have edges, grey areas, contradictions that don't fit into a retention chart. She speaks of craft before myth, of love for music before showcase, of the price of no said at the right time. She doesn't ask for pity, she asks for perspective, and offers her own with the serenity of someone no longer in a rush to convince. The room hears things that rarely make headlines, the names of those who held the fort off camera, the breaks that saved entire seasons, the days when a glass of water was a victory, the rehearsal laughter that glued back together what had been broken. She gives unceremonious thanks to the band that learned to breathe together, to the professionals who chose care over control, to the fans who preferred honest cancellation to risky spectacle. The list isn't protocol, it's a survival map. So, she returns the narrative to where it always belonged, music. He explains that silence is part of the sentence, that harshness is also texture, that truth sounds different from perfection, and that, for this very reason, it demands more work. He says that music doesn't redeem anyone, but it offers language when life lacks vocabulary, and that, if his pain was once sold, today what's for sale is something else. Context. Whoever wants it, takes it. There's a direct, unvarnished request to the audience. Trade judgment for listening whenever you can, to those who sing and those who don't. Don't settle for excerpts that seem complete because they're less work. Remember that every story has a part that can't be captured in a photo, and that someone's silence can be cared for, not dismissed. She looks deeply, as if stamping a contract. If you've heard the pain, listen to life too. The final gesture arrives, a single chord emerges. It doesn't burst, it doesn't show off. It merely ignites a wisp of air. The voice accompanies it with a short, wordless melody, as if whistling a memory that only exists within. There's a beautiful tremor there, an almost nothingness that demands courage to exist before so much light. The note suspends time for a second that seems long enough to fit a biography. At the climax, a blackout. It's not a fall, it's a choice. For a moment, no one applauds. It's as if the theatre understands that silence here is worth more than the roar. When the applause finally comes, it's not for the character, it's for the person who agreed to finish without a scream, without a trick, without apologizing for being complex. The sidelights come back on without hurting her eyes. She returns the microphone to its stand, as if ending a conversation, not a fireworks display. Before leaving, she leaves one last thought in the air, not as a slogan, but as a task. Everyone out there carries stories that have already been edited by others. Take context home, defend the part that isn't in the photo. Don't buy into versions that reduce someone to a moment. The title promised that the truth would surprise. It surprises because it's not loud, spectacular, or always pleasant. It's sober, human, and everyday. And precisely for that reason, it has the power to linger. As you cross the theatre door, the question shifts. Now that you've heard it, what do you do with it? If the answer includes fewer fingers, more listening, and a little courage to say no when the script demands a lie, then the story you just saw doesn't end here. It continues in you.